30,000 years ago, Earth turned cold. Not like winter, not like frost on your window, but cold enough to kill. The winds carried knives. The nights stretched for weeks. Glaciers rolled over forests like sleeping gods, turning trees into splinters and rivers into stone. Entire species vanished. And in the middle of that slow apocalypse stood us. Not kings, not warriors, just barefoot humans. Small, exposed, starving. But somehow, we didn't die. We learned to speak without words. We painted dreams on cave walls. We hunted creatures 3 times our size with weapons made of bone. We discovered fire not just as warmth, but as memory. And when the world seemed to be ending, we built something even colder than the Ice Age: hope. This is the true story of how your ancestors faced extinction and fought back. This is how humans survived the last Ice Age. Today, we'll know about 30,000 years ago, how cavemen survived the end of the world. And you're watching Info Twist Zone.
The first signs came quietly. Migration routes shifted. Animals that once came every spring stopped returning. Trees that had shaded the plains withered. Birds disappeared from the skies. And when the people looked to the stars, there were no answers. Only silence and cold. What had once been a rich, green world was slowly being sealed in ice. Our ancestors didn't understand climate science. They didn't have meteorological charts or predictive models. What they had was instinct and fear. They noticed the days growing shorter, the snow lingering longer, and the game becoming harder to track. The mammoths were moving. The reindeer herds became scarce. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into the jaws of a 100,000-year glacial cycle. And so they moved too. South, east, wherever the animals went, they followed. This was the birth of human migration on a global scale. Small groups began crossing vast distances, across frozen rivers that would one day become oceans, through tundras where nothing grew but frost and wind. Each band of people carried little more than stone tools, fur clothing, and the stories of their ancestors. And in this movement, new adaptations were born. Some groups developed lighter skin to absorb more sunlight in the gloom. Others honed tools to carve meat from frozen bone. Evolution was not a choice, it was the cost of survival. But survival alone was not enough. These early humans brought with them a gift more powerful than any spear: the ability to remember, to teach, to dream. As they moved, they left behind marks. In caves they painted, in stones they carved, in bone they etched symbols that no one alive today fully understands. But the message is clear. We were here. We endured. This part of the world was not empty. They met others along the way. Neanderthals, stockier and stronger, had made these icy landscapes their home for thousands of years. There were moments of conflict, moments of curiosity, and eventually, moments of love. DNA doesn't lie. Modern humans carry the trace of Neanderthal blood. That union was not a conquest. It was a merger of survival strategies, and perhaps of compassion. As the cold deepened, the need for cooperation grew. The world outside was brutal. The wind could strip the skin from your face. Wolves hunted in packs. Food could vanish in a single snowstorm. So humans built their strength in numbers. Tribes formed. Roles emerged. Hunters, gatherers, firekeepers, midwives, elders. Every member had a purpose. Every hand mattered. And then there was fire. It wasn't new, but in the Ice Age, it became everything. Fire meant heat. Fire meant food. Fire meant light in a world that had turned its back on the sun. But fire also meant memory. Around it, people shared stories. They passed on hunting tips, warnings, songs, and dreams. Language itself may have evolved by firelight, because survival wasn't just about knowing where to find food. It was about knowing how to remember, how to pass knowledge forward. That's what fire gave us. A reason to sit, to talk, to teach. The world outside was dying, but in those flickering circles of light, humanity was being born. The nomads of ice. As glaciers carved new continents and swallowed old ones, the humans who had learned to follow the cold became something else. Wanderers of the white world. No longer simply reacting to nature's wrath, they were beginning to anticipate it. Tracks in the snow became stories. The wind was a language. Snowstorms were omens. These weren't just primitive survivors, they were scientists in animal skins, decoding a frozen universe, one blizzard at a time. Life as a nomad was not chaotic, it was rhythmic. Follow the herds, harvest the roots, store the fat, melt the snow. Every season brought its own rituals. Migration wasn't a choice, it was a migration of necessity. And yet, in that constant motion, humans found a kind of permanence. The earth moved beneath their feet, but their knowledge moved with them. They became masters of mobility, sleds made of bone and hide, snowshoes crafted from woven sinew. Reindeer and dogs helped carry loads. They didn't just survive the snow, they danced through it. And their children learned early how to read stars, how to smell storms, how to hear danger in the creaking of trees. In these moments, the Ice Age children grew up faster than we can imagine. Their games were not on fields, but in frost-bitten forests, where one mistake could mean a family's end. Play was practice. Practice was life. These societies were small, but they were not simple. Leadership emerged, not through strength, but through wisdom. The one who knew when to move, where to dig, how to trap, that was the one others followed. They listened to the old, honored the pregnant, and protected the children fiercely. Even in the most brutal cold, humanity clung to compassion, because in a world so inhospitable, cruelty was a luxury they could not afford. And amidst all this, they created bone flutes, shell necklaces, carved figurines of women with wide hips and swelling bellies, fertility, survival, the divine. They didn't separate art from life, they sculpted life from the ice. Every artifact left behind is a cry into time. We felt, we feared, we hoped. But even hope needs a house. Caves, once feared and avoided, became sanctuaries. Humans ventured deep inside, not to hide from predators, but to find something more powerful: connection. Walls of limestone became canvases. Pigments from berries, charcoal, and blood formed animals, handprints, constellations. The first known art galleries weren't in cities, they were in darkness, miles underground. Why paint in the dark? Because they weren't painting for the living. They were painting for the eternal. That's when religion, or something like it, began to stir. The cycles of life and death, the sun disappearing and returning, the dangerous hunt and the sacred fire. These weren't coincidences, they were patterns. And in those patterns, humans saw stories, gods, spirits, ancestors. The world wasn't just cold anymore. It was alive and listening.
This was the beginning of a worldview built not on comfort, but on awe. A belief that even in the harshest world imaginable, life had meaning. That suffering had shape. That death was not the end, but perhaps a door. In this part of the Ice Age, humans were not only fighting extinction, they were discovering identity. They didn't just live in the cold, they became one with it. The rise of the hunters. As the millennia trudged on and the snow thickened, humans honed their deadliest art, the hunt. Hunting wasn't simply about stabbing something with a spear and dragging it home. It was choreography, engineering, and psychology combined. A successful hunt could mean a month of food. A failed one could mean death. So they adapted. They developed weapons with purpose, flint-tipped spears, weighted throwing sticks, and eventually the most revolutionary weapon of the age, the adult. A tool that let them throw spears with terrifying velocity, bridging the gap between prey and predator. But weaponry was only half the story. The other half was strategy. Hunting mammoths wasn't a one-man act. It was a theater of coordination. Scouts tracked migrations for days, identifying weaknesses in the herd. Hunters flanked from the shadows, reading wind and scent. And when the time came, entire bands of humans moved as one, shouting, driving, herding colossal beasts into pits, cliffs, or traps of their own making. These weren't wild attacks, they were surgical ambushes, perfected through failure, and passed down like religion. And when the kill was done, the real work began. Nothing was wasted. The meat was dried and smoked, the fat rendered, the bones carved into tools, needles, tent frames. The sinews became thread. Even the tusks of mammoths were turned into shelters, carefully stacked and draped with hides. In the age of ice, nothing was disposable. To throw away a scrap was to spit in the face of survival. As the hunter's world expanded, so too did their imagination. They began to understand animals not just as meat on legs, but as spiritual equals. Mammoths were no longer just prey, they were ancestors, guides. The moment before the strike became sacred. Some believed in asking permission before the kill. Others performed rites after the feast. Slowly, an invisible web formed between humans and beasts, sky and ground, breath and wind. In these beliefs, death wasn't a failure, it was a necessary passage. They saw cycles in everything. The blood in the snow wasn't just loss, it was life flowing forward. And this is when music truly took hold, not just for pleasure, but for ceremony. Hunters played flutes before the hunt, perhaps to focus, perhaps to summon favor from the spirits. Rhythmic drumming accompanied rituals. Voices echoed in caves with chants that we will never translate, but still feel in our bones. It wasn't about lyrics, it was about vibration, shaking the fear loose, lifting the soul before the spear flew. Meanwhile, women, elders, and children played their own roles, gathering roots under snow, tending the fire, caring for the sick. But don't mistake these tasks as lesser. Without them, no hunter would return to anything. They were the reason to come back. In fact,
The most successful groups weren't the strongest. They were the ones who balanced the hunt with the hearth. There were injuries, crushed ribs, broken legs, infections, but knowledge grew from wounds. Bones set with splints, cuts packed with moss or lichen. Pain taught medicine, and elders who survived these trials became libraries of wisdom. Then came the wolves. At first, they were competition, snarling shadows at the edge of camp, eyes glowing just outside the firelight. But some humans saw something else: curiosity, cunning, hunger that mirrored their own. And perhaps one night, a wolf crept too close to the fire and wasn't chased away. Perhaps someone tossed it a bone. Perhaps that wolf returned, again and again. This was the beginning of one of history's most remarkable alliances. Wolves became dogs. Enemies became allies. These early canines helped with tracking, guarding, warmth, and in return, they got food, fire, and the company of something not so different from themselves. It wasn't a pet, it was a pact. By this point, humans weren't just surviving. They were inventing the Ice Age playbook. It was written in bone and fire, passed down in stories and scars. They had become apex survivors, shaping their environment as much as it shaped them. The glaciers were still coming. The world was still brutal. But for the first time, humanity had something stronger than fear. It had momentum. The first winter gods. As the endless cold became routine, the people of the Ice Age began to search not only for food or shelter, but for meaning. In a world that felt increasingly hostile, they turned inward, into imagination, memory, and mystery. The same humans who had once run from shadows now began to shape those shadows into gods. And in those gods, they found comfort, terror, and an identity that transcended survival. The first deities were not sky-dwelling monarchs. They were spirits of the hunt, guardians of the fire, mothers of the earth. These were gods born not from conquest, but from necessity. A god of the mammoth, a spirit of the cave, a grandmother of the moon. The lines between myth and memory blurred. If a hunt went well, it was not luck, it was favor. If a family killed by a blizzard, it was not chaos, it was punishment, or perhaps grief. These beliefs helped humans explain the unexplainable, giving them a sense of control in the world ruled by ice. And so rituals deepened. Totems were carved from antler and tusk. Stones were arranged with care. Caves became temples. The flicker of torchlight made bison on cave walls appear to move, and perhaps that motion was sacred. Some painted stars and animals together, suggesting a belief in cosmic cycles. A bear might not only walk the earth, but also the heavens. In these moments, the first seeds of religion were sown. But belief wasn't just about awe, it was about uniting people. Shared stories became cultural glue. Tribes that once might have fought over resources began to trade gifts, totems, and tales. One group might revere the saber-tooth as a messenger. Another might see it as a demon. But both agreed it was powerful. And that agreement was enough to build peace. Seasons shaped these beliefs. When the sun returned after long months of darkness, it was a resurrection. When a child was born during a famine, it was a miracle. The Ice Age didn't kill hope, it refined it, made it harder, sharper, more sacred. Death wasn't an end, it was part of a cycle.
Burial practices began to reflect this. Bodies were no longer left to the wind. They were placed in shallow graves covered with ochre, surrounded by tools and ornaments. Some were buried, curled like infants, perhaps suggesting the belief in rebirth. Others were burned, their ashes scattered on the wind as if returning them to the sky. These weren't just corpses, they were travelers. The journey didn't stop with death, it began there. Meanwhile, music and language continued to evolve. The sounds around the fire, chants, howls, claps, and hums, began to merge into primitive songs. Some mimicked animals, others told stories of distant places or ancient heroes. In this way, even the youngest child could carry the past. Knowledge was no longer just taught, it was sung. And singing made it unforgettable. But the gods weren't always kind. Sometimes the weather turned without warning. Entire clans vanished beneath avalanches or into crevices. Wolves attacked, ice cracked. In these moments, gods became monsters. Some stories warned of spirits who lived in the ice, who could steal your breath in the night. Others told of demons who wore the faces of lost family. Fear became folklore, and folklore became survival guide. Fire itself took on sacred properties. The hearth became a holy space, the center of the family and the bridge to the spirit world. No one let the fire die, not just because of the cold, but because extinguishing it was an invitation to darkness. And darkness, in the minds of Ice Age humans, was not just absence of light, it was a realm of ghosts. Yet, through all this, they continued to build, to create, to love. Couples bonded for life. Children were cherished, protected fiercely. Joy existed, raw, defiant joy. Laughter echoed through caves. Games were played. Dances erupted for no reason other than the thrill of motion. In their harshest days, humans still made room for celebration. By now, human beings had moved beyond mere endurance. They were creating culture, identity, memory, myth. And in that creation, they laid the foundation for something bigger than any glacier: civilization. When the sky caved in, around 28,000 years ago, the Ice Age tightened its grip. The sky dimmed, not just from clouds, but from ash. Somewhere far beyond the known lands, a volcano had erupted. Not just any volcano, a monstrous eruption, belching ash into the stratosphere, painting the sky in fire and dust. The sun turned red, then gray, then absent. Crops, what little humans managed to gather, failed. The animals moved again, disoriented, scattered. And the cold? It deepened like a wound. To Ice Age humans, this was more than a disaster. It was a war between gods. Something in the sky had been broken, something sacred. The stories changed. New spirits appeared, bringers of darkness, thieves of warmth. Some tribes began to wear black ochre, mimicking ash. Others lit ceremonial fires and refused to let them die, as if keeping the sun itself alive. The Ice Age wasn't just physical anymore, it was psychological. It crept into dreams. And yet, they endured. Humanity's resilience was unmatched. Where crops failed, they turned again to hunting. They followed the reindeer into deeper snow, the mammoths into new valleys. Some developed food storage, pits dug into frozen earth, lined with stone or bark, filled with smoked meat and sealed like treasure. Others began drying roots and berries, trading recipes as sacred knowledge. Ice Age cuisine was born, not for pleasure, but for preservation. Shelters also evolved. The days of sleeping beneath hides were over. Now humans built deeper dwellings, pit houses, burrows, even huts made of mammoth bone and snow. Ingenious and warm. The walls told stories, scratch marks from children, fire soot drawings, prayer symbols.
These weren't just shelters, they were homes. But the greatest weapon against the ash wasn't stone or fire, it was the mind. Humans became philosophers long before they wrote anything down. Around fires, they asked questions. Why is the world broken? Why do we suffer? Why do the stars move? One tribe believed the earth was grieving, mourning lost spirits. Another believed the sky was a living being, its eyes closed in sorrow. These weren't primitive minds, they were poetic, brilliant, reaching towards understanding with nothing but metaphor and bone. As survival became harder, bonds deepened. Tribes merged, marriages became alliances. Clans created councils where elders and hunters, mothers and firekeepers debated next steps. The concept of leadership was born, not by domination, but by wisdom. The one who could find the herd, predict the storm, mend the wound, they became the first chiefs. Children were taught with urgency. Knowledge could no longer wait until adulthood. Every child was a potential lifeline for the group. By age 5, they could start a fire. By 7, they could identify dangerous mushrooms, spot predator tracks, sharpen bone needles. Childhood was shorter, but not lesser. In fact, children were often seen as closer to the spirit world, their dreams taken seriously, their songs respected. And always, art continued. The darker the world became, the more vivid the paintings. Caves glowed with ochre reds, soot blacks, ivory whites. Horses with flaring nostrils galloped across ceilings. Mammoths danced in torchlight. A human hand, painted over and over, as if to say, I am here, I matter. Then came the ice storms, blizzards that lasted weeks, walls of snow that buried entire valleys. The wind screamed like a living thing. In those days, people didn't leave their shelters. They waited, sang, told stories. They learned that even silence could be sacred. That survival was not just movement, but patience. When the storms cleared, the world had changed again. The rivers shifted. Some groups never reappeared, but the survivors emerged leaner, wiser, more united. They began carving paths through the snow, literal roads made of trampled ice and marked with stone. Early trade networks formed. Obsidian tools from distant lands appeared in unfamiliar caves. Someone, somewhere, was moving. The Ice Age, for all its cruelty, was forging not just people, but a species-wide community. In those years, the earth seemed to whisper, only the clever, the kind, and the brave will stay. And so we did. Fire keepers and bone doctors. The further we journeyed into the Ice Age, the more refined our knowledge became. Fire, once a desperate flicker stolen from lightning, was now mastered tool. But those who tended it were more than just warm hands. They were guardians of the future. Fire keepers, as they were later remembered, didn't simply stoke coals. They protected stories, treated wounds, held silence when the tribe despaired. Their hearths became hospitals, schools, places of justice, and sometimes the only light in a long, frozen night. And beside the fire keepers stood another new breed of Ice Age human, the healers. They weren't doctors in the modern sense, no stethoscopes, no labs, but what they lacked in tools, they made up for in wisdom and intuition. A cracked rib, wrapped in sinew and snow moss. Infection, sucked clean and covered in resin. Fevers, treated with teas made from bark and bitter roots. These early medicine people, often women, sometimes elders, passed down their cures through stories, dreams, and rituals. They remembered which plants killed and which healed, which bones splinted best, which chants calmed a dying man. And still, new challenges arrived. The climate wasn't the only enemy. predators followed the warmth of human camps. Hyenas with jaws strong enough to crush bone, cave lions as tall as men, even bears. But perhaps the most feared was the saber-tooth, fast, silent, and not afraid of fire. People told stories of saber-tooths that moved like shadows, dragging victims from tents in silence. Some tribes turned the beast into myth, the embodiment of death. Others began wearing saber-tooth teeth as amulets, believing it made them braver. In response, humans adapted again. They began to form night watches. Rotating guards kept the flames high and ears alert. Traps were dug around camps.
Warning stones were stacked near paths. Dogs, descended now from the wolves who once haunted their camps, were bred for vigilance. A single bark could mean the difference between life and death. And so humans became nocturnal planners, learning to defend the hours most dangerous. Despite the fear, trade flourished. Word spread of other groups, families who carved tools from volcanic glass, painted beasts no one had seen before, or sang songs in unfamiliar tongues. Tribes began to share more than just goods. They shared culture, language, laughter. A stone carved in one region might appear hundreds of miles away, tucked inside a cave. How did it get there? No one knows for certain, but it suggests that even then, humans knew how to connect. That community wasn't just local, it was global, even in the Ice Age. Children learned faster now, taught by stories told through dance, by carvings scratched into bones, by watching the hands of elders stitch wounds or tan hides. Education was everywhere. There were no schools. The world itself was the classroom. Then came the Star Watchers. Some humans, curious about the heavens, began to notice patterns. That certain stars returned each season, that the moon's cycle matched the tides and the migrations. They tracked the skies using bones marked with notches, stones stacked in lunar alignment, caves painted with strange wheels of dots and beasts. These were the astronomers of the Ice Age, laying the foundation for calendars, navigation, and even timekeeping. One day, they'd help us sail oceans, but for now, they helped us predict when the world might shift again. Yet for all their knowledge, Ice Age humans still felt small. The cold was constant. Food was never guaranteed. Children still died. Whole tribes disappeared in avalanches. And so the people did what humans do best. They told stories. Stories to make sense of pain. Stories to honor the lost. Stories to remind the living that they mattered. One such tale told of a girl who danced alone during the storm. Her footsteps, they said, summoned spring. Another tribe believed a great mammoth held up the sky, and when he shook, it snowed. Another believed the fire itself had a voice, and that it whispered wisdom to those who dared to listen in silence. And when a firekeeper passed on, their torch was buried with them still lit, so their spirit could carry warmth into the afterlife. By now, humans had moved beyond surviving nature. They were shaping it, predicting it, learning from it. The Ice Age had made them not just tougher, but wiser, more imaginative, more connected. Their journey wasn't just a march through snow, it was a transformation. The Great Migration begins. By 26,000 years ago, Earth's climate reached an icy crescendo. The glaciers were at their widest, covering more than 25 million square kilometers. Sea levels dropped by over 400 feet, revealing new land bridges, ancient superhighways that connected entire continents. And that's when something remarkable happened. Humans began to move. in massive waves, driven not by conquest, but by necessity. From what is now Siberia, small bands of hunter-gatherers braved the howling cold and crossed the Bering Land Bridge, a now submerged connection between Asia and North America. Imagine it, a windswept plain of ice and tundra, echoing with the crunch of mammoth bones and the distant howl of wolves. There were no maps, no signs, just instinct, stars, and hope. These were the first footsteps of humanity into a new world. And they weren't alone. Alongside them traveled the animals they hunted: giant ground sloths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, bison twice the size of those today. North America was a wild Eden, raw and untouched. And humans? They adapted fast. New tools, new techniques. They carved spear throwers, atlatals, that could hurl projectiles farther and deadlier. They learned new traps, studied the habits of animals they had never seen before. And as they moved south, they left behind traces, bones, fire pits, etchings, stories frozen in time. Meanwhile, back in the Old World, other bands headed west and south, into Europe, the Middle East, Africa. In the caves of Chavaux in modern France, humans painted lions, rhinoceroses, bears, not just hunted, but observed. Some drawings had shading, perspective, techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for tens of thousands of years. These weren't just pictures, they were revelations. Artistic genius in the age of mammoths. But migration wasn't just about exploration. It was also escape. As the glaciers expanded, familiar hunting grounds vanished. Forests turned to tundra. Rivers froze. Families fled famine, conflict, and fear. And yet with every step into the unknown, they evolved. Bones showed changes in diet, body shape, even brain structure. The Ice Age didn't just change the planet, it sculpted the species. This period also birthed what some call the first long-distance relationships. Tribes spread out over continents still maintained contact through traders, messengers, and stories. A necklace made of shells from the Mediterranean was found hundreds of miles inland. Obsidian tools from volcanic regions appeared deep in northern tundras. Humans were building a network, not with wires, but with footprints and firelight. But it wasn't easy. The world was still cruel. Avalanches buried camps. Droughts scorched lowlands. Entire herds vanished, and sometimes so did people. Whole lineages erased by disease, starvation, or catastrophe. But the survivors passed on the stories, warnings, wisdom, and wonder. They said the stars were holes in the cloak of night, letting through the light of the afterlife. They said mammoths cried when they died. They said there was a place beyond the glaciers where the sun never set. And with every tale, they walked farther. Children born during the migrations were raised with wanderlust in their blood. They learned to walk with their feet and think with their stories. They could track game across unfamiliar lands, recognize edible plants never seen before, and greet strangers not with weapons, but with gifts. One of the most astonishing discoveries of this period was music. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory have been found across Ice Age Europe, some over 35,000 years old. These weren't simple whistles. They had tuned holes designed for melody. Someone, somewhere, sat in the mouth of a cave and played songs into the void. Not for survival, for beauty. And this is more than fire, more than tools, is what makes Ice Age humans feel familiar. Their world was brutal, but they still made music. They still painted. They still danced. Even when the world tried to freeze them into extinction, They responded with creation. By now, humans had walked across continents, survived plagues of ash and storms of snow. They had mourned, celebrated, explored. And they were still not done, because something was stirring. A shift in the ice, a change in the skies, a ripple in the wind. The Ice Age was reaching its most dangerous chapter.
The edge of extinction. By the time the last great chill settled over the Earth, around 24,000 years ago, humanity was walking a razor's edge. Survival wasn't guaranteed anymore. Some species were already gone. The short-faced bear, the giant ground sloth, even Neanderthals, those ancient cousins who had once shared caves, tools, and perhaps even love with Homo sapiens. Now they were silent, and humans stood alone. Food was scarce. Herds thinned. What once was a land teeming with life now stretched wide and silent, blanketed in a kind of deathly peace. Families grew smaller. Childbirth became a gamble. One wrong hunt, one infected cut, one long winter could end an entire bloodline. And yet, we stayed. We kept moving. We kept believing. To fight back against extinction, humans innovated like never before. Hunting parties grew more coordinated, using signals, formations, and decoys. Some tribes developed early snowshoes, wooden frames laced with hide to move over drifts without sinking. Others tamed reindeer as companions, carriers, even warmth bringers. In desperate times, innovation was no longer luxury, it was instinct. And as the earth froze, minds burned brighter. Spirituality deepened. Death was too common to ignore, and so it was woven into the fabric of life. Ice Age funerals became more elaborate. Bodies were wrapped in furs, laid with beads, tools, and red ochre, symbolizing blood, life, and rebirth. In some caves, the dead were placed near paintings, as if to say, "You are now part of the eternal story." Priests and priestesses emerged, not rulers, but interpreters of mystery. They read animal bones like scrolls. They listened to dreams. They became the tribe's memory, keepers of rituals that tied the living to the unseen. And in a world slipping into darkness, their presence brought light. But not all tribes chose to wander. Some began to settle, at least seasonally. In river valleys, sheltered from the harshest winds, humans built semi-permanent camps, pit dwellings ringed with mammoth tusks, community hearths, food caches. These were the first whispers of villages, the first roots in the snow. But their ancestors made sure they never forgot. Caves became temples, artifacts became heirlooms. The story of survival was now sacred because without it, the warmth meant nothing. Without memory, there was no meaning. And so, as the Ice Age faded, it left behind not just meltwater and stone, it left behind a people forever changed, wiser, softer, perhaps, but stronger too, not just in muscle, but in mind, in spirit, in song. The birth of myth and memory. As the world warmed and the glaciers crept back toward the poles, something extraordinary happened. Humans began to tell time, not in seconds or hours, but in seasons, moons, and stories. The past became a compass. Elders spoke of the great freeze, the walking beasts, the mountains of ice. And for the first time,
The idea of history, of a shared past, took root. In the scattered settlements of post-Ice Age Earth, people began creating more than just tools or art. They created mythologies. These weren't just bedtime tales. They were survival guides wrapped in magic. One tribe told of a bird who dropped seeds from the heavens, teaching humans how to grow food. Another spoke of a serpent who swallowed the sun each winter and regurgitated it in spring. These stories weren't lies. They were metaphors for understanding a world in flux. Fire was no longer just warmth. It became sacred. Many groups gathered around central hearths that never went out, tended day and night. These eternal flames symbolized continuity. As long as the fire lived, so did the people. Children were told they came from the fire. The dead were returned to it. And as language matured, so did questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens after death? These weren't just philosophical musings. They were attempts to make sense of a brutal yet beautiful world. Priests became philosophers. Hunters became poets. The brain, sharpened by survival, turned inward. Some of the oldest proto-temples emerged during this time: stone circles, earth mounds, cave sanctuaries marked with carvings of celestial patterns. People watched the stars more closely. The sky, once a fearful void, became a map. Certain constellations meant planting season. Others warned of approaching storms. The birth of agriculture meant more than full bellies. It created time. Time created memory, and memory birthed civilization. But the Ice Age had one more trick to play. Roughly 12,900 years ago, as the world basked in its new warmth, something triggered a sudden return to cold. Scientists still debate the cause. Perhaps a massive meltwater pulse disrupted ocean currents, or a comet struck North America. Whatever it was, temperatures plummeted again in what we now call the Younger Dryas. Winter returned with vengeance. Crops failed, herds scattered, chaos reigned. And here was the test. Would humanity collapse or adapt? Again. They adapted, faster than ever. This time, we had tools, not just stone and bone, but memory and myth. Stories of the first Ice Age gave clues on how to survive the second. Tribes shifted, merged, migrated, but this time they carried seeds. They rebuilt faster. The fire never went out. And just as suddenly, around 11,700 years ago, it ended. The Younger Dryas faded. Spring came back. For good this time. And when it did, it was like the earth exhaled. Populations exploded. Within a few thousand years, humans would build the first cities, invent writing, divide land, trade across seas, worship gods with names, create nations, and forget what it took to get there.
Agriculture spread like wildfire. In Mesopotamia, barley and wheat took root. In China, millet and rice transformed river valleys into green kingdoms. In the Americas, maize began its slow journey toward empire. Each region, isolated by geography, yet united by necessity, created the same solution: to settle, to sow, and to stay. And where people gathered, complexity followed. Villages grew into towns, towns into proto-cities. Jericho, Çatalhöyük, these weren't just clusters of homes, they were blueprints. People began to specialize: potters,
weavers, tool makers. Not everyone had to hunt anymore. Some made things, some traded, some taught. But agriculture was a double-edged sickle. It required planning. It demanded discipline. Crops failed if ignored. Fields had to be defended. Food could be hoarded, and thus inequality deepened. Landowners emerged. Leaders who controlled grain stores held the fate of others in their hands. The age of the clan elder gave way to the age of the ruler. Power became centralized. Walls rose, not just around settlements, but around wealth. And yet this shift also sparked an explosion of creativity. With food secure, minds turned to the abstract. Writing emerged, first as tallies on clay, then as symbols, then as language. Scribes were born, histories recorded, taxes collected, gods praised. Temples towered where mammoth bones once lined the horizon. The divine was no longer just in fire or stars. It now had names, temples, rituals. Religion codified the stories of the ice. The harsh gods of winter gave way to fertility deities, sun gods, river spirits. But the old fears still lingered in myths, of floods, of famine, of cold returning. And those fears were not unfounded. Climate still ruled from the shadows. Droughts punished the careless. Plagues stalked the crowded cities. Trade networks faltered. Civilizations rose and fell. But unlike before, collapse no longer meant extinction. The memory of the Ice Age, the lesson that resilience mattered, allowed many to rebuild. Across the globe, patterns repeated. The Nile Valley, the Indus River, the Yellow River, the Andes, the Mississippi. Independent civilizations, unaware of one another, crafted pyramids, calendars, irrigation systems. They watched the stars, honored their dead, and built cities from mud and willpower. And behind it all, in every tablet, every myth, every carving, was a shadow, a reminder that before all this, we lived in caves. We ran from wolves. We bled for fire. Even as humans tamed lightning and measured time, part of us always looked backward. The Ice Age had shaped not just our bodies, but our minds. We remembered scarcity. We revered survival. Our deepest fears and highest hopes were carved by cold. So when the great ziggurats rose, when Stonehenge aligned with the solstice, when pyramids reached for the heavens, it wasn't just ambition. It was memory made monument. A declaration. We are still here. And this is where we pause, on the edge of history, from cave to city, from myth to monument, from ashes to empire. The Ice Age was over, but its story, it had only just begun.
Civilization did not rise from comfort. It rose from cold, from fear, from the shared memory that life is fragile and that together we endure. The first civilizations stir. The soil that once lay hidden beneath ice now birthed something extraordinary: abundance. The warmer climate meant longer growing seasons. Crops flourished, rivers swelled with life. Humanity, once at the mercy of the mammoth, was now its own provider. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was prosperity. With that came a revolution unlike any before.
the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture spread like wildfire. In Mesopotamia, barley and wheat took root. In China, millet and rice transformed river valleys into green kingdoms. In the Americas, maize began its slow journey toward empire. Each region, isolated by geography, yet united by necessity, created the same solution: to settle, to sow, and to stay. And where people gathered, complexity followed. Villages grew into towns, towns into proto-cities. Jericho, Çatalhöyük, these weren't just clusters of homes, they were blueprints. People began to specialize: potters, weavers, tool makers. Not everyone had to hunt anymore. Some made things, some traded, some taught. But agriculture was a double-edged sickle. It required planning, it demanded discipline. Crops failed if ignored, fields had to be defended, food could be hoarded, and thus inequality deepened. Landowners emerged. Leaders who controlled grain stores held the fate of others in their hands. The age of the clan elder gave way to the age of the ruler. Power became centralized. Walls rose not just around settlements, but around wealth. And yet this shift also sparked an explosion of creativity. With food secure, minds turned to the abstract. Writing emerged, first as tallies on clay, then as symbols, then as language. Scribes were born, histories recorded, taxes collected, gods praised. Temples towered where mammoth bones once lined the horizon. The divine was no longer just in fire or stars. It now had names, temples, rituals. Religion codified the stories of the ice. The harsh gods of winter gave way to fertility deities, sun gods, river spirits. But the old fears still lingered in myths of floods, of famine, of cold returning. And those fears were not unfounded. Climate still ruled from the shadows. Droughts punished the careless. Plagues stalked the crowded cities. Trade networks faltered. Civilizations rose and fell.
But unlike before, collapse no longer meant extinction. The memory of the Ice Age, the lesson that resilience mattered, allowed many to rebuild. Across the globe, patterns repeated. The Nile Valley, the Indus River, the Yellow River, the Andes, the Mississippi. Independent civilizations, unaware of one another, crafted pyramids, calendars, irrigation systems. They watched the stars, honored their dead, and built cities from mud and willpower. And behind it all, in every tablet, every myth, every carving, was a shadow, a reminder that before all this, we lived in caves, we ran from wolves, we bled for fire. Even as humans tamed lightning and measured time, part of us always looked backward. The Ice Age had shaped not just our bodies, but our minds. We remembered scarcity. We revered survival. Our deepest fears and highest hopes were carved by cold. So, when the great ziggurats of Ur rose, when Stonehenge aligned with the solstice, when pyramids reached for the heavens, it wasn't just ambition. It was memory made monument. A declaration: we are still here. And this is where we pause, on the edge of history. From cave to city, from myth to monument, from ashes to empire.
The Ice Age was over, but its story, it had only just begun. The flame beneath the empire. Beneath the polished marble of Rome and the golden rooftops of ancient Thebes, beneath the scrolls of Greek philosophers and the incense of Indian temples, the Ice Age still breathed. It whispered through myths and rituals, through cautionary tales and the laws etched in stone. Even as empires rose, humans remained haunted by the cold that nearly killed them, and by the fire that saved them. Nowhere was this more evident than in our architecture. Look closer, and you'll see it. Temples aligned with the solstices, burial chambers pointed toward the North Star, hearths that burned at the heart of every home, shrine, and palace. The flame, once a desperate flicker against mammoth bone, had become the center of everything: warmth, cooking, ceremony, power. To control fire was to command the gods. Religions around the world honored it. In Zoroastrianism, fire was purity and truth. In Vedic rituals, the sacred flame carried prayers to the heavens. In Rome, the Vestal Virgins kept an eternal fire burning in the Forum, lest the city fall. Across cultures, the ancient memory of freezing death gave flame a near-divine status. But fire was not the only gift from the cold. The very structure of civilization, our sense of time, trade, war, and wisdom, grew from Ice Age roots. Consider timekeeping. The lunar calendars of early societies mirrored the old hunters' habit of tracking moon phases. They needed to know when animals migrated, when berries ripened, when winter returned. Trade. It began with survival, bartering meat for flint, fur for tools. Even war, terrible as it is, echoed tribal skirmishes over scarce Ice Age resources. And wisdom, our philosophy, our storytelling, our hunger to understand the world, that too was shaped by nights spent in firelight, interpreting stars and shadows. As empires expanded, humans moved further from their primal roots. Yet in moments of crisis, those roots re-emerged. Plagues, famines, invasions. Every collapse was a cold wind, and every recovery a rediscovery of the old warmth. In Europe, the fall of Rome plunged much of the continent into what we now call the Dark Ages. But in monasteries and oral traditions, stories of ancient resilience lived on. The Norse spoke of Fimbulwinter, a great freeze before the end of days. In Asia, cycles of yin and yang preserved the idea that warmth and cold, growth and decay must always balance. Even in Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec built cities with sacred fires at their cores, pyramids mimicking volcanoes, Earth's fire made stone. The ancient trauma of the Ice Age didn't disappear. It was encoded into our religions, our architecture, our fears. Deep down, we remembered. And in remembering, we prepared. The Renaissance would not have happened without the preservation of ancient fire. The spark of curiosity buried under ash, but never fully gone. As science rose, so did our understanding of our past. Fossils told of lost creatures, glaciers carved valleys we once wandered, and buried tools, stone blades, cave paintings, bone needles, reminded us of our origin.
But with knowledge came hubris.
As industrial revolutions roared and steam replaced sinew, we began to think we had conquered nature, that the cold could never return, that survival was a problem of the past. And yet, the earth remembers. The glaciers still groan in their sleep, the poles still whisper warnings. Climate, like myth, moves in cycles. Perhaps the Ice Age is not over. Perhaps it never truly was. And as we build ever taller towers and ever faster machines, as we chase comfort and forget struggle, we should pause, just for a moment, and look back to the fire, to the cave, to the silent footprints in the snow. Because everything we are began there. Our cold reflection now, as we stand in glass towers reaching into the clouds, as satellites orbit above and data flows faster than thought, it's easy to forget that our story began with bare feet on frozen ground. The cavemen of the Ice Age were not brutish cartoons, but the architects of resilience, engineers of instinct, philosophers of survival. They didn't just scrape by. They laid the emotional and cultural groundwork for everything we now call human. They taught us how to endure the unbearable. They showed us that stories matter, that painting a mammoth on a cave wall isn't just art, it's prophecy. That dancing beneath the stars isn't just ritual, it's remembrance. That feeding your neighbor isn't just kindness, it's the blueprint of civilization. We inherited more than tools. We inherited trauma, yes, but also triumph. Their struggles live in our DNA. Their choices echo in our morality. Their adaptations became our technology. The way we build communities, create religion, invent fire, wage war, make peace, it all flows from the icy crucible of the Pleistocene. We built skyscrapers on bones, cities on ashes, empires on firewood. And here we are now, facing our own kind of ice age. Not a cold of glaciers, but a cold of connection. Isolation in the digital era, political storms, economic droughts, environmental panic. The temperature's rising, yes, but in many ways we are freezing again. Numb, distant, alone. So maybe the question isn't just how did they survive the last ice age? Maybe it's what would they do now? They would gather, they would tell stories, they would dance around the fire. Maybe your version of the fire is a podcast, a YouTube video, a conversation with a stranger. Maybe your hunting party is your team, your family, your online community. Maybe survival today means remembering we've done it before and we'll do it again. The legacy of the Ice Age isn't buried under glaciers. It's alive in your empathy, your creativity, your refusal to give up. You are the descendant of those who looked death in the eye and whispered, "Not today." So the next time life feels unbearably hard, when the winds of stress and grief start howling, when the path ahead is hidden under the snow of uncertainty, remember, you were built for this. Not by chance, not by luxury, but by cold, by claw, by courage. We are still the children of the ice, and that is how cavemen survived the end of the world. You've been watching Info Twist Zone. If this journey sparked something inside you, don't forget to subscribe, share the story, and keep the fire burning. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what made you. See you in the next episode. Until then, stay warm.